The honourable member for Louis Saint-Laurent. Mr. Speaker, it's strange to see the Liberal Party, who for the last 2 months has been unable to manage this crisis, and then to see the Prime Minister have this idea. He decided to try to sue the leader of the official opposition. But, Mr. Speaker, not only did our leader not move at all, he even repeated and republished exactly what he had said before. So now we're just waiting for the trial. Will the Prime Minister do what he said, or on the contrary, will he do what he normally does and just have a lot of empty rhetoric? The Honourable Government House Leader. Mr. Speaker, we have a lot to say, and that is exactly why we have an economy that is working today. We know that Canadians are better off today than there were under the 10 years of the Stephen Harper government. But the member across the way is asking questions, even though he knows very well that the leader of the opposition changed the words that he used. But before doing that, Mr. Speaker, the leader of the opposition deleted the statements that he had made because he knew that he was continuing to mislead Canadians. And that is unacceptable. Thank you. The honourable member for Louis Saint-Laurent. What's unacceptable, Mr. Speaker, is a Prime Minister who shows contempt to Canadians by doing one thing and saying another. 2 months ago when the Globe and Mail broke the story of this scandal, the Prime Minister said the very next day, that's totally false. There have been 4 resignations since then. Another thing the Prime Minister said is, I was never informed of any danger of political interference. He said that until 2 weeks ago in this House, he admitted that in fact he had been informed on September 17th. Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister carry out his threat of legal action, and if so, when? The Honourable Government House Leader. Mr. Speaker, we know that Canadians need to hear the truth. That's exactly why the Prime Minister waived solicitor-client privilege and cabinet confidence, and that's exactly why all of the facts are now public. But the Conservatives continue to mislead Canadians, and that's unacceptable. Now, the member across the way is doing the same. He is following in the footsteps of his leader. But I think we need to show some respect for Canadians. We know that they've heard the truth. All of the facts are public, and Canadians can make their choice. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for New Westminster, Burnaby.
Canadians are increasingly worried about the political interference by this Prime Minister and his office in our independent justice system. But instead of reassuring them, this Liberal government continues to try to cover up their wrongdoing and scandal. Now, Canadians know there was inappropriate pressure on our justice system for their rich Liberal friends. The OECD's anti-bribery unit is also paying attention. They put Canada on notice in a letter to the NDP that they're watching what the Liberals are doing. So will Liberals just do what's right, reassure the OECD and Canadians, and call a public inquiry now?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, in March, the Minister spoke with the Chair of the OECD Working Group, and she confirmed to him that we are fully committed to cooperating with the good work that they do. Obviously, we fully support the OECD's work in all such endeavours, and Canada is a strong supporter of the rules-based international order, including the OECD, which is a flagship organization. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Sherbrooke. Mr. Speaker, if they respected the OECD, they wouldn't have shut down the Justice Committee investigation. Now, the Liberals are trying to change the channel on their interference scandal, but people still want to know the whole truth about the SNC-Lavalin scandal. The government seems to have 2 sets of rules, one for their buddies and one for everyone else. The cozy relationship between Loblaws and the Liberals is just the latest example of how the Liberal team really works and who they work for. This game has gone on long enough. People have a right to transparency. Will the government finally launch a public inquiry into interference allegations before the next election?
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
In March, the Prime Minister talked to the OECD Working Group and confirmed that we are ready to fully cooperate with the excellent work of their team and that we fully support the OECD's work. Canada is a fervent defender of the international rules-based international order, including the OECD. The Honourable Member for Sherbrooke. Mr. Speaker, We learned this week that the Minister of Finance is working very closely with big Canadian banks. This is another example of the way that Liberal cronies get special treatment. This Liberal government promised more transparency. They promised they would do politics differently. And they also promised real measures to fight climate change. But what are those measures? Apparently $12 million to one of the richest organizations in this country. They gave $12 million to Loblaws, a lovely gift from the Prime Minister. When will the Liberals finally focus on real priorities instead of the priorities of the rich and privileged?
L'honorable.
The Honourable Minister for the Environment. Mr. Speaker, I'm always happy to talk about what we're doing to fight climate change. We're putting a price on pollution. We are eliminating, phasing out carbon. We are investing in green technology. And the subject that the member is talking about, he should know that we are investing 25% of that investment to reduce 50,000 cars a year from the road. I think that's a good investment, and we all need to work together to fight climate change. That includes provinces, companies, cities, and everyone.
Westminster Burnaby.
Well, the Environment Minister should also actually ask Canadians whether they think it's a good idea to give $12 million to a company that made nearly $1 billion in profits last year, all while refusing to pay its staff a fair wage. Now, people across the country are desperate for this government to act on climate change, but instead they see Liberals padding Loblaw's profits. Now, two Loblaw's lobbyists were at a Liberal Cash for Access fundraiser with the Prime Minister and the Environment Minister's senior staff. So Canadians want to know, is that why Loblaw's got this sweetheart deal?
Honourable Minister of the Environment.
No, the reason Loblaw got this deal was because there was an open tender process that was open to businesses, communities, big businesses, small businesses, Indigenous peoples. 54 winners. They were based on emission reductions. In this case, in this open, transparent process run by public servants, the winner, we are only putting up 1/4 of the amount of the $48 million, $50,000 reduction emissions. It's like 50,000 vehicles off the road. We should all support that. We should all be looking to work together to tackle climate change.
The Honourable Member for Calgary, Rocky Ridge.
Well, Mr. Speaker, everybody knows that the Prime Minister has been misleading Canadians now for over 2 months. He said that the SNC story was false, that no one raised concerns, that he did it for jobs, and yet each one of these statements is a proven falsehood. Then, he foolishly tried to bully the opposition leader into silence by threatening to sue. But the opposition leader has now called this ridiculous bluff. It's the Prime Minister's move. When will we see him in court?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, it's important that Canadians know, and I guess members should also be informed, that when people say things that they should not say, there is consequences to that. And what happened is that the leader of the official opposition is using terminologies and making accusations that are inappropriate. And so what we did, Mr. Speaker, is that we won't stand idly by, and Canadians can have confidence. We put him on notice. And really quickly after he received notice, he deleted those tweets. He took a step back from his messaging and now reiterates his new messaging that I guess we helped him discover. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For Sarnia Lambton.
Well, Mr. Speaker, our leader has repeated exactly the words that he said in the first place. It's the Prime Minister that has been misleading Canadians. He told them the SNC story was false, and that's not true. Then he said no one raised concerns. Not true. Then he said he did it for jobs. The company says that's not true. The Prime Minister's threat to sue the leader of the opposition is clearly a bluff. If he truly believes he has a case, when will we see him in court?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, they say repetition works, and when it comes to hearing the answer, obviously repetition does not work. So let me remind the honourable member that's more focused on privatizing health care than she is focusing on making sure that we have a universal healthcare system that actually works for all Canadians. That's something that Canadians pride themselves in, but that is not the focus of the dreamy future Minister of Health, as she likes to refer to herself as. So I will remind her that all facts are now public. The Justice Committee meetings took place in public. They took place in public so that witnesses could appear, and the Prime Minister ensured that solicitor-client privilege as well as cabinet confidence was waived.
Honourable député de Montmagny.
The Honourable Member for Montmagny-Lys-Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Mr. Speaker, it's the Prime Minister himself who misled Canadians. He said that the SNC-Lavalin story was false, but obviously that wasn't true. Then, he said that no one had raised concerns with him. That was also untrue. If he really believes that the truth is defamatory to him, when are we going to see him in court, Mr. Speaker? When? The Honourable Government House Leader. Once again, Mr. Speaker, all of the facts about this subject are public because the Prime Minister waived solicitor-client privilege and cabinet confidence. Members who sit on the Justice Committee looked at this issue for 5 weeks, they studied it, and they decided themselves on the outcome. Now, Canadians will know everything about the facts because they're all public. We will always call out the Conservatives if they mislead Canadians, because that's not how we should be doing things in this place. The Honourable Member for Beauport, Côte de Beaupré, Île d'Orléans, Charlevoix. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, obviously, misleading Canadians isn't what people should be doing, but that's exactly what the Liberal government has been doing from the very beginning of this scandal. The Prime Minister put our leader on notice. Our leader repeated word for word what he said outside this House. Every time that we've asked questions about SNC-Lavalin, the Prime Minister changes his story. So, will he act on this?
The Honourable Leader du Gouvernement.
The Honourable Government House Leader. Mr. Speaker, the member across the way forgot a very little detail, which is that the Prime Minister sent a letter, put the Leader of the Opposition on notice, because he has a history of misleading Canadians. We don't think that this is the way things should be done. So the Prime Minister sent a letter to the Leader of the Opposition, and then the Leader of the Opposition must have read the letter, and then deleted his online statements and deleted the tweets. I think that he and his team then changed the words that were used, and now those are the words he's repeating.
Grenville, Thousand Islands, and Rideau Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has been misleading Canadians for months now. That's nothing new for this Prime Minister with his track record of 4 ethical breaches. Now he has the audacity to threaten the opposition leader with a lawsuit for speaking the truth. But the opposition leader won't be intimidated. When will the Prime Minister put his money where his mouth is and meet the opposition leader in court?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, we should have confidence in our institutions and the court of law, and no one should be intimidated because we know that the rule of law in Canada is intact. And that's exactly why when the Leader of the Official Opposition received a notice from the Prime Minister, he quickly erased his tweets, he erased his online statements, and then he chose better words. And that probably was the right thing to do, and now they continue to repeat those words. But, Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives have a history of misleading Canadians. This is now new terminology that they are echoing from us, and they did it in December, they did it in February, now they just did it in March. But most recently, they set out this publicly funded tax booklet, and they forgot to talk about the climate action incentive, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, and Rideau Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, we know the Liberals are obsessed with Twitter. They've started diplomatic feuds on Twitter. They've damaged the integrity of our immigration system on Twitter. They've even praised dictators on Twitter. But this isn't about Twitter. This is about the opposition leader's March 29th statement. That's why he repeated every word from that statement inside and outside the chamber. So when will the Prime Minister meet the opposition leader in court, or should I just check his Twitter?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, we know that members who want to be in the Conservatives benches have to follow their leader. They're not allowed to speak out of turn. So I encourage him to follow his leader on Twitter so that he can maintain that speed. But more importantly, Mr. Speaker, what is clear is that Conservatives are focused on...
Order. The honourable member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes asked a question, and the honourable government House Leader was answering it, and I'm having a hard time hearing the answer. I'm sure the honourable member is as well, so I want to ask everyone to maybe just show a little politeness. I notice a lot of students watching today, and we want to set an example for them. We don't want to act out of line. The honourable government House Leader has 18 seconds left.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I will just finish by saying that the Conservatives will remain focused on us, but we will remain focused on Canadians, because that's exactly who we are here to serve. And the member who occupied that seat prior to that member was actually a member of the National Security Committee of Parliamentarians, and we just actually tabled the report for the first time. It was dedicated to him.
The honourable member for Desnete, Mississippi.